Good morning and welcome to Safecall's annual webinar on our benchmarking report. So we've got lots of things we want to talk to you about in the next half an hour. But before we get started, I would like to do some introductions. So for those of you who haven't met me previously, I'm Jo Lewis. Joanna is my Sunday name, and I'm the Managing Director at Safecall. I've been here about 2.5 years now. And I'm looking forward to speaking to you about everything that I'm seeing happening within the world of whistleblowing and what we're seeing within our stats. But before we get started, I'd also like my colleague Rachel to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Rachel. I am the Account Management Team Lead here at Safecall. I'm so excited to walk through this data with you today as well.
So we thought before we got into the data, which Rachel's going to take you through in about 5 or so minutes, we'd talk a little bit about what we're seeing, because we have 1,000 clients globally, and we're talking to people all the time about whistleblowing and all of the wonderful things in the whistleblowing world. And so we thought we'd talk a little bit about kind of the trends generally that we've been seeing before we get into the actual data. So I'm not going to go through all of these points, you'd be pleased to know, but I'm just going to pick a few things out. So ultimately, the main thing, and we are going to talk about this in a moment in a little bit more detail, that we get asked about a lot is legislation, because as you'll all be aware, there are lots of new there's lots of new legislation in different countries worldwide around whistleblowing and around wider supply chain legislation, which also has reporting mechanisms within it. So clients are very regularly asking us about kind of legislation and how perhaps they can deal with it. We do not, we are not legal experts. We have many partners who are legal experts who, you may have been on a previous webinar that we've done around legislation, and we plan to do a few more, so keep an eye out for them. But we will talk at a high level about the legislation and what we've seen. But other than that as well, we've definitely seen much more focus from organisations with modern slavery. Again, that is largely legislation driven within the supply chain as well, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think as well, there's been media interest within whistleblowing cases for a long time. 2023 wasn't the first year that happened, but I definitely think that the media has driven more awareness around whistleblowing, and and driven organisations to think more about kind of how they're approaching their reporting channels. So we're seeing a lot more kind of conscious decision making around how to improve culture, how to protect reputation, and having lots of conversations around that. So rather than going into any of these other points, because we'll talk about them as we go through the presentation, I'm just going to pass across to Rachel, who's just going to talk a little bit more about some of the legislation that we've seen.
Yes, so it's quite interesting looking at the change in, I suppose, whistleblowing landscape, certainly over the last few years since 2021 onwards. We're just highlighting a couple of the key points here on the screen now. But within the UK, we've seen the Protection for Whistleblowing Bill come to light as sort of a proposed new legislation. And that's to try and start to bring us in line a bit with the EU legislation as well, as certainly driving some of the data we're going to show you later on within our benchmarking that we're seeing. We then, of course, as well, for the EU side of things, we've got the EU directive. That's been implemented now in the majority of countries. I think there's just a couple remaining via the sort of national frameworks for each individual country. Again, we've seen since sort of 2021, that's just a steady increase of that, driving sort of the behaviours within our customers. Again, then with Europe outside of the EU, we're seeing approaches, and there's a lot of different approaches taking place to adopt a similar framework to the EU directive. But again, there's just a lot of movement going on there as well. And then, of course, coming back to the EU again and kind of underpinning all of this, we've got the Supply Chain Act, particularly things like, the German Supply Chain Act as a key one that comes to mind, and any also DE&I policies and procedures that are coming into play too. these are all behind the scenes sort of increasing the the microscope, the view on whistleblowing at the minute, and the sort of the conversation as well that's taking place, I think, within organisations. And it does provide sort of a big backdrop to the kind of, the increased reports we're going to see. It's probably a spoiler report within the report ongoing here. And then again, actually just a point as well around the rest of the world as well. I think the EU directive is driving a lot of this and the conversation about legislation, but certainly the rest of the world as well is beginning to look more closely at this as well. Would you add anything to that?
I think I mean it's a huge subject and not one that we're going to do justice to today, but I think it's interesting. Generally, my view of kind of what all of these pieces of legislation are trying to achieve is enhanced protection for whistleblowers, so that there's less fear of retaliation, and also enhanced scope of who's covered by each of the laws. I think they're the two kind of the way that I would sort of distill it down into sort of two main points. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in the UK. Obviously, we've got PIDA in place at the moment. The bill is in Parliament. We don't know what's going to happen with it, but there's quite a lot of debate at the moment because, as many of you will know, within the US there are rewards for whistleblowers coming forward, and there's been a lot of debate and quite a lot reported in the press around whether or not that's something that we should be thinking about. So it'll be quite interesting to see how that kind of plays out over the next year or two. But it's good to be aware there is legislation, and we do believe that it is probably driving kind of some of what we're seeing in terms of the volumes that Rachel is now going to start talking about.
Yeah, so to begin with, as a backdrop before we get into the data, it's just worth pausing for a second and explaining sort of where we get our data from and how we go about that. I'm sure a lot of you joining us today are customers of Safecall, so we might have been through this before. So Safecall's got about 1,000 customers. We anonymise basically all of our data, all of our reporting data from over the last year, and we do this annually. We remove the top 5% and the bottom 5% of sort of our extreme customers, I suppose, both way in terms of the volumes of reports that they get. And we focus in on that sort of core middle section of reports. That data, like I say, is anonymised and then broken down into things like sectors and particular classifications to then allow us to kind of distill this information that we're looking through here today. So that's where it comes from. Like I say, we do this annually. The report will be following up afterwards. So we're going to look at some high level points today that you can definitely go into then more detail sort of around particular sectors and things like that too. So we like to look annually at the number of reports you would be, per one report you receive, the number of employees you would expect to have to receive one report per year. So what I'm showing you here on the screen now is just a really simple sort of diagram that shows this, but basically our reports are ever increasing year on year. So you can see there that per one report in 2020, we would expect that from 520 employees. So to receive that one report, you'd have 520 employees in the organisation per annum. We're now at a point where we're actually seeing one report come from 380 employees per annum. So that number basically is decreasing the number of employees we would expect to see one report coming from. I think last year was about 1 per 400 employees. So year on year, we're seeing more reports coming from the same sort of cohort of people within an organisation, the same number of employees.
And just to add something there, Rach, if you don't mind, I think what's interesting about this is a couple of things. This doesn't include any of your internal reports, so obviously they would be in addition to this, but it kind of demonstrates to me that there is more perhaps awareness of how to speak up within organisations, and also more guess, more willingness to speak up, because as the number of reports are going up, that means that more people are speaking out more regularly, which can only be a good thing, in my opinion, because that means that organisations are then hearing about what's going on and are then able to look into them and do something about them for the benefit of everyone. So it's great to see that we're going to talk a bit about trust and trust in systems, and to me that would demonstrate an enhanced trust within the whistleblowing system if you're getting more reports to action.
Yeah, exactly that. And like we say, we're just seeing that increase year on year. So then just moving on to look at a bit of high level information. So like I said before, we segment our data down into classifications and then sub-classifications below that. So just starting looking at the classifications to see the general trends, I suppose, year on year. And I'll talk you through the statistics we're looking at here in front of you now. So what I find most interesting about this stat is essentially, whilst we're getting more reports year on year, we're actually not seeing that much of a shift in where those reports are being classified. So we're looking here at basically dishonest behaviour, general reports, health and safety, and human resources. And you can see sort of the big blue block is our human resources reports. And you can see each year consistently that is staying around that between 50 and 60% basically of our reports. And then much the same for the other segments as well. They're only moving by, a couple of percentages each year and staying very much the same. So my overall, there's nothing kind of groundbreaking particularly about this statistic. I'd say my overall observation is that we're just seeing more reports that are coming through into the same channels. So the channels aren't changing that reports are being classified as, it's just the volume of them that are coming through. And just to look a little bit more detail, so I'll go into, like I say, the sub-classifications are a bit more nuanced. And I'd definitely say refer to our full benchmark report to see the statistics kind of for your sector and things like that in a little bit more detail. But these are some of the main observations we've seen from the data. Really interesting. So if I take the first point and well, we've seen a 4% increase in the corporate governance and non-compliance related reports. And also the non-compliance of regulations related reports are both on the rise, which is really interesting when you think back to our early slide about the legislation coming into play. These are sort of things that we're just seeing increasing and becoming more of a topic of conversation, I suppose, and something employees are aware of and looking out for more now within the organisation. Equally then as well, I'll kind of group them together slightly, but we're seeing a rise in substance abuse reports, that's 6%, so quite significant, but also product contamination as well. The substance abuse one is quite interesting. It's sort of levelling out now to a point it was pre-COVID, but we did see sort of in 2020 and 2021 during the COVID sort of years that the volume of reports that we were seeing related to substance abuse dropped off quite drastically. And that was obviously because of the visibility of these kind of reports. You're not, if you're not seeing things taking place in the organisation, you're not reporting on them. And it's just quite an interesting insight into how the world's changing, I suppose, pre and post COVID as well. And that particular statistic, you'll see it more in kind of one of our next charts as well. We can look at that in more detail. And the same for the product contamination. I mean, that's at 4%. Good people are reporting on that, and we're seeing that the visibility of that, I suppose, being on the rise too. I think my favourite statistic on here, or the most interesting statistic, I should say, actually, though, is the modern slavery being statistically significant for the first time. This is something that we've not been able to really report on previously. The volumes haven't been kind of share-worthy, I suppose, in this kind of setting. But we're at a point now where we're actually seeing a volume of reports coming through against that category, which again kind of signals back to those changes in legislation, particularly like the Supply Chain Act and things like that, driving these reports forward, and just the change in the world, I suppose. Is there anything you'd want to comment on to do with that, Jo?
I think you covered that perfectly.
Cool. So to dive into some more of the classifications, or sub-classifications, I should say, on this one. So within the human resources tab we looked at before, under that classification, we have a number of sub-classifications. So you can see them here. We've got bullying, discrimination, harassment, modern slavery, racism, unfair treatment, and victimisation. Now, when we're looking through the statistics, there's not huge changes year on year. I mean, your bullying stays is pretty consistent year on year, the volume of reports that are coming through. We've seen a steady increase since 2020 in the number of discrimination reports, although that has levelled off in the last 2 years. Harassment, again, that increased quite significantly from 2021 onwards, of that 2022, 2023. The volumes have gone up there. And then our racism reports have stayed pretty steady throughout as well, with sort of 2 or 3% on each of those. What is quite interesting, though, I think, is that those unfair treatment reports are decreasing year on year, which I don't have a reason or a theory as to particularly why that is, but it is certainly interesting to see that trend coming through. It'll be interesting for you to look at that in your own data as well, whether that's because things have been segmented out into other areas earlier on, perhaps triaged earlier on through to the HR team and things like that, or whether it is actually a trend that we're seeing less unfair treatment taking place in the workplace. I'll leave that to you to come to your own conclusions on. As a category as well here. An interesting theme is theft reports are were slightly up on last year, but generally decreasing since COVID from 2020 and 2021. We can see they've dropped back down since then, where they reached a peak in the volume of reports. Integrity reports are slightly on the rise. They're back to a high, which they were last seen in 2019. I do wonder whether this comes back again through to kind of our policies, procedures, and the way people are looking at whistleblowing and making reports, whether they are just increasing due to the education they have around the channels they have available and what they should be reporting on. I don't think there's too much else I would call out necessarily on this one under dishonest behaviour. And then looking at our general classification, which covers corporate governance, data protection, environmental, failure to act on previous reports as well falls under this category, policy-related reports, regulatory compliance, and also reputational reports. So we can see here that data protection reports is the main one that stands out to me as being really on the rise this year. So 2022, in 2022, we had 7% of those reports falling into that category, whereas now in 2023, we're at 11%. You can see the shift there visibly when you're looking at the graph. Again, interesting. There's obviously a lot of legislation again around data protection that's coming into play more, that I would certainly make the assumption is beginning to drive those reports, and that increase in volume of reports coming through there. We're also seeing generally a decrease in the number of reputational reports. And corporate governance is the other one I'd call out here as well, which you can see in 2023. It's the small blue on the far left-hand side there. It's the first time it's looked quite significant on these charts that we do. So that has increased quite heavily, which again, I would say comes back to the legislation point we made at the beginning and that driving things. Anything you'd add there, Jo?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, I think, certainly kind of all of the governance and data protection reports, it comes as no surprise really that we're seeing increases in those areas because of, all of the enhanced focus and legislation within that area. I also just wanted to pick up on Daniel's question in the chat, and we will try and come to all of the questions. We've got some slides around trust, which Andrew's asked about, so we'll come on to that in a moment. But within the HR category, there will be all sorts of different types of reports, including grievances and other matters. Our view and kind of what we normally do is that if somebody's made well, first of all, we're duty bound to pass all of our reports on to you. They are your reports, but also it's important that if somebody's made the effort to report a matter, that you are aware of it, regardless of what the subject matter of that report is. So yeah, those HR are very wide-ranging in topic.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So one last slide as well, just looking at our classifications and sub-classifications to share with you today, and that is the health and safety sub-classification. So we can see here, as I just mentioned earlier, you can see the substance abuse reports increasing this year compared to last, and certainly to the year before. And you can see the drop off I was suggesting during COVID years there in 2020. They shot right down. They sort of half the number of reports we're getting related to substance abuse, and they are slowly creeping back up year on year. And then you can also see the yellow there, the product contamination has really only become sort of significant statistic here in 2022 and 2023. Again, so that is just one to watch out for as well, being on the rise, certainly that we're seeing. And again, general safety reports are decreasing since, well, from the 2020-2021 point. Again, we're seeing that sort of, I suppose, it's probably a normalization of the reports that were spiked during COVID times as well. So that's probably the key trends from this section. Like I said, in our benchmarking report, you'll see a little bit more detail on your kind of subsectors and things like that as well. And do speak to your account manager as well to get a little bit more detail and insight into your own data.
So just thought it'd be interesting to share some information around what we're seeing with regards to kind of how people contact us, and you know, so like anonymity types of, you know, whether they use phone, whether they use our online portal, etc. So before sort of talking too much about that, I get asked a lot, and we get asked a lot about, you know, how do people want to contact, and whether the hotline remains an important tool for people. And we absolutely believe the hotline remains important. And in fact, we see our hotline as being an absolutely key part of our service. For anyone who doesn't use Safecall, who might be on the webinar, we use former police officers with around 25 plus years experience as our call handlers. And what that gives us is a team of people who are highly trained and able to put people at ease, deal with people in any sort of emotional or different sets of circumstances from all sorts of different cultures. And we believe that's really important, because when somebody's raising a matter which is serious and which is emotional, they need to feel that, you know, that they can trust the process, and that they're going to get the, you know, the right, I suppose, the right outcome, or certainly that they're going to feel that they've made the right decision speaking up about that matter. So why am I telling you this? Well, currently, I mean, we've absolutely, and you'll see this on the next slide, we absolutely see that the online channel continues to grow in terms of how we receive reports. Many people globally want to report online, and you know that we use the internet, we use our computers, our phones, etc., for lots of things. So why wouldn't we want to report matters through that means? However, still a third of people contact us using the phone, and we've had stats and we looked into this that show that if there's something particularly serious people want to talk about, there still is a tendency to want to speak to somebody rather than to type that. So we think that's really important to offer that. In addition, 37% of the world do not have access to the internet, so their only option is to use other methods. What's interesting, though, within all of this is within the legislation, there is no requirement to use an external provider like Safecall. So why do all of these organisations, and why do you all choose to use us? And I think a lot of that comes down to the trust in the system and the process. Ultimately, you know, we do quite a lot of surveys of our customers, and the wider sort of I guess the wider world. I was trying to say that, the wider organisations outside of our customer base. And feedback we get is still that there's a large percentage of employees that do fear retaliation, and regardless, it's sometimes of how robust your internal systems are, how much work you put into those. There's still a fear that people can't be truly anonymous if they're reporting internally. So that tends to be a big reason that organisations do use an independent channel such as Safecall, because that anonymity is guaranteed, and people often do just feel more at ease being able to make that report. And it just gives them then that whole channel choice, so they can either, if they feel comfortable reporting internally, brilliant, they can report internally, they can report by a phone, they can report by an online channel. So I think the more options you give your employees, the more likely you are to hear about what's happening within your organisation. And I think that does play out in the stats. So just looking at kind of anonymity for a moment there, and we thought it'd be interesting to have a look at kind of how that differs. And again, as Rachel said, there's a lot more data within our benchmarking report, which you'll be able to receive after this webinar. But I think it's interesting. So a very large proportion of the reports we get are anonymous. And I think that demonstrates, and as Rachel said, those numbers of reports are going up every year. So we're getting more anonymous reports as well as everything else. And I think that does demonstrate that people do want to tell you what is happening. They do want to speak to you, but equally they do want to protect their identity for fear of retaliation or for whatever reason. You know, there are lots of good reasons. So it's good for us to see that, because it means that you are hearing about stuff, and if you're using our portal, you know that you can then communicate with those anonymous reporters as well, which means that, you know, previously it was probably quite difficult to sort of find out more information if somebody was anonymous, but now we've got this two-way communication. It means that you can go back, and if that person engages with you, you can find out more information, which obviously makes any investigation that you want to do so much easier if you can sort of find out a bit more detail. So I think that's quite interesting. And, you know, obviously you can see that there's different parts of the world there that, you know, how it's interesting that South America is very high number of anonymous reporters. And then we're seeing, you know, the Middle East, for example, we get we get a lot of telephone reports, which is on the next slide, from the Middle East, particularly. The preference there is absolutely using the telephone. And it's unsurprising then that we have more named reporters within the region, because again, what we find, and we have feedback on this from many clients, is that if somebody calls us and then talks to a call handler, because of the process, and because the process is explained to them in terms of what's going to happen with their report, where it's going to go, how it's going to be handled, we do tend to see that even if they initially are wanting to remain anonymous, we often find that they, by the end of that call, that they are happy to share their details with yourselves, and therefore are less likely to remain anonymous. So there is a link, I think, with how people report and whether or not they are anonymous or named. So just moving on to my last slide before I answer any other questions that anyone has. And I wish I'd worn my glasses because I can hardly see these stats now. But I've already mentioned that the Middle East, I think that's particularly interesting. You know, telephone reporting is still quite above what we see as the average, because if we think the average is 2/3 online and 1/3 telephone, then you can see there are certain regions of the world that seem to prefer to speak to somebody, you know, North America being another one that's a bit higher, and then there's certainly regions where telephone is less of a preference. I think Asia is an interesting one there, because there's a really high proportion of web reporting and using of software tools rather than speaking. And a lot of these things, I think, are driven by culture as well. You know, different cultures like to approach things in different ways. Just before I pass back to Rachel, because I've talked for a while now, and I'm sure the stuff that Rachel will add. But Angie, you asked about kind of increasing trust, and hopefully I've answered that. But, you know, just to sort of make sure that I think that having that channel choice and giving people the opportunity to either report independently or through your internal channels will give them the feeling of that trust in the system, because they know they can remain anonymous, and they know that you know, it's not going to go any further, and there won't be any fear of retaliation. So I think that just thinking about kind of how you offer those different channels to your employees and to the wider supply chain will certainly help them. And then promoting it and making sure people are aware of the service and that they're aware of how it works. I think they're probably two of the main things. The only other thing I would add, and then I promise I'll be quiet, is once you've got a report, have a think about what you're going to do with it as well, because we haven't talked about kind of training and how you manage investigations, because that's not what this webinar is about. But it's really important to think about, once you receive that report, you know, going back to that reporter and telling them what happens next, and making sure that the people that are dealing with the report have the right levels of training so that they understand the best way of investigating that, and then considering, you know, whether or not you want to use external investigators if you feel that the matter is sufficiently serious, or that, you know, you don't have the skill set internally. You might want to consider outsourcing that to somebody like Safecall, and then, you know, again, that enhances that trust within the process with that independence. Rachel, what would you add? Because I'm sure there's lots of stuff that I should have mentioned that I've forgotten.
So to start with Daniel's question on building, Andrew's question on trust, I would also add that I think, well, leading on from your point there, setting really clear expectations when you're communicating with your reporter. If you're using Safecall and using the messaging section, letting them know, A, that you've received the report, thanking them for submitting that report is so important. I think it's actually often really overlooked. And then also setting an expectation of when they should re-log back into Safecall or check for updates from you. So, you know, letting them know that in 3 days' time you will have, you know, processed the report and actually have reviewed it and be able to suggest the next steps from that point. Even if it's kind of a no action sort of message, making sure that you're communicating that at all stages cannot be, it's such a simple thing, but I do think it is often overlooked, and it changes the experience so much for the reporter from being that of kind of a positive one to a negative one, I suppose. So communication is key. And then also just making sure that any sort of education is coming from the top down and is really encouraged from your senior leadership and down within the organisation, has such a huge effect on kind of the visibility of the reporting channels available, and, you know, the push of messaging around it, but also really changes the culture around this kind of thing to one of feeling positive about speaking up. So there would be my 2 key points on that. But we did do a whole webinar on it, so we should definitely link that as well for you, because there was one, I think it was last year, but the point's still valid. And then also, just on the slide that we've still got on the screen now, I would just say, and Joe mentioned it earlier, but I'd just reiterate the point, that you can see there is such varied trends in where the way someone wants to report across the world. So if you are an organisation that is operating in multiple locations, you really need to make sure that you're pushing and raising awareness of all ways that someone can make a report, and not just kind of the preferred choice within the organisation, which may be web or maybe phone. Make sure that both are so clearly visible as kind of equal options that are available, you know, and then you're covering all bases for everyone around the world, because as you can see, there is totally different preferences worldwide.
Thanks, Rachel. So if there are, I'm just going to move to the next slide. If there are any more questions, please do add them in the chat now. Just, I suppose, final thing from me, we mentioned at the beginning that we do quite a lot of these webinars, and we have quite a lot of sort of different information available about lots of these subjects. So please do kind of follow Safecall on LinkedIn if you don't already, and just look out, because we coming up in the next sort of few months, we've got more. We're working with one of our legal partners, and we'll be doing another sort of set of information around the changing legislation globally. So that will be great, because they've got, you know, up to the minute information available, and they'll be able to answer any questions. We're also doing some work around kind of managing investigations and the best way of approaching that. So there'll be quite a lot of content being delivered just to help you with your kind of, you know, how to approach investigations, sort of best practice. And again, that will be also with one of our legal partners, looking at it not only from kind of workplace investigations and HR issues, but to those more legally sort of focused investigations as well. So do keep an eye out. Thank you so much. I can't see any more questions, so I won't keep you any longer from your busy Tuesdays. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope that's been useful. And as we said earlier, all of these stats and many, many more will be available in the benchmarking report. And as Rachel mentioned, your account management team are always happy to hear from you. So if you want any additional information, do get in touch with us and we'll do anything we can to help. So thanks again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.